Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring a Wealth Creation Approach in Nuclear Host Communities. I'm Brett Schwartz, an Associate Director at the NADO Research Foundation. Really happy to be bringing you this webinar today as part of the Nuclear Closure Communities Technical Assistance Program funded by the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Now, this program is led by Smart Growth America with support from the Nuclear Decommissioning Collaborative, the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and us at the NADO Research Foundation. So whether plant closure is imminent or not anticipated for many years, it's never too early to start planning for a post-nuclear future in your community. And a wealth creation strategy is a valuable approach to support economic diversification and resilience. Now, today's webinar will introduce the fundamentals of wealth creation, including its core principles, the multiple forms of community capital, and how to build value chains, all with the focus on tapping into existing assets and thinking regionally about economic development. So we at the NADO Research Foundation strongly believe in this asset-based approach to economic development, and it's my hope that by the end of the webinar today, you'll feel the same way. So before I introduce Melissa Levy, today's speaker, I want to share a few framing remarks and discuss a little bit more about the technical assistance program so you can learn about how we can support your community and your organizations. So here's a look at the national landscape. Our research shows that nearly 20 nuclear power plants have been or are currently being decommissioned. We also anticipate that between 5 and 10 additional plants could close within the next 5 years. And an additional 55 communities host active nuclear plants, where their economies are often dependent and closely linked to the plant's operation. So as you know, nuclear plants provide high-paying jobs, often in rural communities, support municipal and school budgets through taxes and payments in lieu of taxes, generate a wide network of indirect jobs, and can enhance civic life by sponsoring local events and funding scholarships. So the major focus of this technical assistance program is to plan for economic diversification and reduce reliance on one major economic engine. Our goal is to help communities and regions better prepare for a post-nuclear future by building capacity and providing technical assistance. So we hope you can visit our website here listed up on the screen to learn more and connect with us. And we want to encourage any community that is home to a nuclear plant, whether it's been closed for a while or isn't scheduled for many years, to reach out to us. No matter where you are on this timeline, it's always important to be thinking about the future, what lies ahead, and how to best position your communities. And this is something we'll be talking about much more on the webinar today. So here's some of the ways that we're providing assistance through this free program. Webinars like this one. We also have a monthly newsletter and also opportunities for information sharing and education. We provide focused technical assistance and support. And we're also building out a national community of practice so that we kind of learn from each other and lean on each other as we go through this process. Now, the services provided through our team are free of charge, as this program is funded generously by the Economic Development Administration. Additionally, EDA is also providing funding through its Nuclear Closure Communities funding stream that was announced back in May 2020 to support communities and regions that are home to nuclear plants. So our team is here to help you navigate this process and consider your options. We can bring capacity and help develop project ideas. Just last week, our team hosted a webinar that really dives into the details of this funding opportunity. So you can review that recording and other resources online at Smart Growth America's website. And of course, reach out to us at any time with any questions. Just a few quick logistics before we get started. Again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. If you do have any questions, type them into the questions box, which will be on the right side of the screen in the control panel, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end. The slides and recording of this webinar will be made available shortly. You should all receive an email sometime tomorrow with a link to the recording, slides, and some additional resources that you'll be hearing about on today's webinar. And of course, to get more information about the program, to sign up for this newsletter, and to connect with our project team, please reach out to smartgrowthamerica.org/nuclear. So with that, I'd like to welcome Melissa Levy as today's trainer. Melissa is someone I've known and respected a long time in this field, and I'm really glad she'll be able to share her expertise and knowledge with all of you today. Melissa is the principal and owner of Community Roots LLC, based in Vermont, and has over 20 years of experience in small town community and economic development, including 12 years with Yellowwood Associates and 5 years at the National Association of Development Organizations. Now, unfortunately, Melissa and I never overlapped during our time at NADO, but I'm really fortunate we've been able to collaborate on some other opportunities like today's webinar. Melissa's worked with federal, state, and local governments, nonprofit organizations, foundations, and citizen groups on a wide range of issues, including agriculture, forestry, nature-based tourism, land conservation, and much more. Now, she lives in Heinsberg, Vermont, and also serves on the community's Economic Development Commission. So Melissa, thanks so much for being here with us. Always great to see you. Looking forward to your presentation, and we have some interactive components as well. So I'll bow out and turn things over to you. So thanks again.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be here. I worked at NADO a while ago, and always excited to work with NADO folks. I do rural economic development consulting through Community Roots, and I also lead the WealthWorks Northeast Regional Hub. So I bring WealthWorks and wealth creation kind of work to the Northeast. And I work all over, but I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, so next slide, Brett. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do today. I'm planning on talking to you about the wealth creation approach. We're gonna talk a bit about discovering assets and then how to build on those assets to create economic opportunities in light of a nuclear plant closure or anything else, actually. Talk about what a value chain is and how they're structured, and also considering economic sectors based on the assets that you have to work with. And since we can't do introductions, which I always like to do, I thought we'd do a quick poll just to understand who we've got, and if you do have a nuclear power plant near you, what the status is of that. So if you can just do that poll, we'll see who we've got in the room, and we'll go on from there. Great, so we'll just give you a couple seconds and we'll go from there. I'm going to be talking about a plant that closed in Vermont as an example, so I'm excited to talk about that. I had a great conversation with those folks. Okay, so here we go. We've got, so a lot of folks don't have a plant, and then there's some that are open and some that have announced closure in the next 5 years. So this is great, and some closed. That's really, I mean, no matter what your status is, I think thinking about a wealth creation approach and building on the assets in your community will be really valuable, I hope. So yeah, anyway, this is just a slide. The next slide is just some kind of news stories that we see about nuclear plants. Actually, a lot of these, or several of these, are from the nuclear plant in Vermont, which I'm going to talk about, called Vermont Yankee. It's in Vernon, Vermont. And but yeah, nuclear plant closures bring economic pain to cities and towns. But thinking ahead is really important if you want to lessen that pain and plan for closure. So if you can go to the next slide, Brett. So there are positive impacts to having nuclear power plants, and certainly the folks in Vernon told me all about those. And as you can see here, it's obviously a clean, reliable energy source, creates a lot of jobs, often very high-paying jobs. In the case of Vernon, pretty high above the state average. They contribute billions of dollars to the local economy through tax revenues. And then there are direct effects, right? The plant buys things, and they buy goods and services and labor, but there's also secondary effects that we forget about, like they support softball teams in town, or they use local restaurants and stores to, their employees use those things. There's pizza and all kinds of food and entertainment that goes along with the people with that plant. So these are just a handful, but these are some of the things that I heard from Vernon. And if you have a plant, I'm sure that you may have heard about these and others. Next slide, Brett. But then there's obviously impacts when a nuclear plant closes. And these are some of the ones I heard from Vernon. I had a great conversation with their folks there. Obviously a reduced tax base, the plant pays a lot of taxes. And that leads to a reduction in infrastructure funds, and also leads to some public services suffering cutbacks as a result of the reduced tax base. So that affects schools, and it affects police and fire and emergency response. And then it does impact some of those other, like, more intangible things in our communities. There's less of a demand for small businesses. If you don't have the plant buying pizza or supporting, buying pizza for the local softball team, then those small businesses are hurting also. So, that's kind of, as we think about these impacts, there are ways to kind of consider how to, especially ahead of time, if you can, think about building on the assets that we have to build economic opportunities. Next slide. So I wanted to introduce Vernon. And again, Vernon is the home of Vermont Yankee, which actually closed in 2014. But these are their stats. There's 2,200 people from the 2010 census. The median household income is, as you can see, it's higher than the state median by $10,000. That's about 20 square miles, and there are 924 housing units. And you can see the housing values went up from 2000 to 2019 pretty significantly, almost doubling. Because these are high-paying jobs that a lot of the folks employed had nice houses. So next slide. I just wanted to kind of show you where we're talking about so you can get a handle. This is in the far southeast corner of Vermont. I am up near Burlington near the lake, but this is in the southeast corner. It shares a border with New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The town of Vernon. And if you go to the next slide, we go in a little closer so you can see exactly what we're talking about. The Vermont Yankee was on the Connecticut River, which is a big river that goes from Vermont all the way down, I think, and certainly into Connecticut. And it's just outside the city of Brattleboro, which is one of Vermont's larger cities. Vermont doesn't really have many cities. Burlington is our biggest at about 40 or 50,000 people. Brattleboro is a pretty small city, but it still counts. Next slide, Brett. So some of the impacts that they saw in Vernon, I had a really great conversation with them, was just, their identity and their social fabric are being lost, is what they told me. They lost, a lot of jobs were lost, property tax revenues. The municipal budget decreased by 20%, and that actually meant that their taxes increased to make up for that loss. They had to eliminate their maintenance and police departments. They've since contracted with the county sheriff to patrol 20 hours a day, 20 hours a week, 20 hours a day. That would be a bit much. And they subcontracted their maintenance. They cut the library budget and the free programs at the rec center. And there, another thing that we don't think about is Vermont Yankee was giving lots of donations to local nonprofits and the local fireworks and things like that, which are now those are missing also. And then, there were businesses that relied on Vermont Yankee for a lot of their business, and those have since closed. So they're in a tough spot right now, but they're working by talking about how to build on the assets they do have. Now, Vernon is a farming community, so they have a lot of agricultural land, and they're trying to maintain that agricultural land by investing in conservation easements. Something that we talked about was, can they think about building on that agricultural land. Is there value added production that they could consider? They have some dairy, they have some diversified farms. I think it's mostly dairy though. But there is, and dairy is in a tough spot right now, but value added dairy, has some investment, requires some investment also. They're also in the midst of updating their town plan and kind of developing a post-Vermont Yankee resiliency plan and an enhanced energy plan, because of course it affects their energy production also. And then they have recreation land, and with the Vermont Yankee plant right on the banks of the Connecticut River, as that plant gets cleaned up and remediated, there may be opportunities to build on those natural assets right along the river, to work on trails and riverfront access. And then they also have a town forest. So they are thinking about how to build on some of their natural and built assets. Another thing, if you can go to the next slide, Brett, is they're working on a village center idea. The Vermont Council on Rural Development does these community visits, and the idea is to come to a community, bring together the community, and facilitate a discussion about, what that community, how that community wants to grow, and what it wants to be. And so one thing that came up in that process was this idea of having a community center. So not every community has one, and they are really useful in terms of gathering and even some economic development as well. So a group started as Vermont Yankee was closing, called Friends of Vernon Center, and they're working on this village center idea. And Entergy, who was connected with the Vermont Yankee, actually gave the town the Governor Hunt House, which is, you can see here, a beautiful old historic building, which will become the community center. They have since qualified for a village center designation by the state of Vermont. And the hope is that this community center will be a catalyst for more placemaking kind of work. There is no real kind of community center now. There's not really a lot of shops or places to eat or go. And so I think the hope is that this will catalyze some of that. And yeah, anyway, so yeah, we wanted to do another poll, trying to make this as interactive as we can. So wanted to ask, what best defines your community or region's current approach to economic development? Every community is different. I think, Vernon was very focused on keeping Vermont Yankee happy. And that relationship went a long way. But now, of course, we're thinking about supporting entrepreneurs, and I think they might be thinking about attracting some outside businesses and firms. They have some great assets close to a railroad. They're right on the river there. They're not far from an interstate. So they have some great infrastructure to kind of build on. Okay, great. So a nice mix. We've got some attracting outside businesses, some retaining and growing established businesses, and supporting small businesses and entrepreneurs, which is great. I mean, I think any community really wants to have a mix of that, right? We don't want to put all our eggs in the attracting outside businesses, but we also recognize that not everybody is an entrepreneur. So thanks, Brett. So yeah, anyway, part of my job today is to share with you a different way of thinking about your community and doing economic development differently. So these are some of the principles of this wealth creation approach that I'm going to be sharing with you. One is creating opportunities for local ownership and control of assets in your community. And we talk about multiple forms of wealth or multiple kinds of community capital or assets. And then we want to be improving livelihoods for everyone, including those on the economic and social margins. So we're really talking about a demand-driven approach. Next slide, Brett. So wealth, again, wealth, that term has a lot of, carries a lot of weight with it. But in this approach, we're really thinking about wealth as not just money. We're talking about all the assets that contribute to the well-being of people, places, and economies. And on the next slide, we'll see what we mean when we talk about that. In this approach, we use 8 forms of community capital. There are other approaches that have more or less. This one has 8. So you can see, go through them fairly quickly, but individual capital is really about the health and well-being and skills of individual members of our population. Natural capital is just like what it sounds like. It's the natural assets around us: land, plants, animals, water, and air. Financial capital is our kind of traditional idea of money as financial capital. Social capital, I'm sure many of you have heard about social capital, is really about trust, relationships, and networks between people and organizations. And they're really critical to any of the work that we want to get done in communities, is bringing those networks and relationships together. Intellectual capital is the knowledge, creativity, and innovativeness of a region. Built capital, again, is pretty straightforward. It's the physical infrastructure and information infrastructure in a community or a region. So buildings, roads. Now we talk about telecommunications and fiber and things like that. Political capital is connections and influence of individuals and organizations. It's not just politics. It's, it could be anchor institutions in our community. It could be schools. It can be government and can be politics, but it's not just that. And then cultural capital, which is traditions, identity of a region. Sometimes this can be positive, and sometimes, there can be a culture that's negative also. Yeah, so those are the 8 forms of capital. And I think on the next slide, we're gonna, this is a tool I just wanted to share with you. It's kind of the first step in inventorying your assets, is how I think about it. It's also in the handouts tab on the control panel if you want to use it. I find this a great tool for if I'm in a community, for kind of getting an idea of where people think the community is in terms of different kinds of assets. It's a scale of 0 to 5, 5 being the highest amount of that capital you can have. And the idea is to, at this point in time, where are you in your community? And you can see it's only wealth if it's healthy and fully functional. And if the region owns or controls it, again, getting at that local ownership and control of assets. And only if it can make decisions about how to maintain it and use it. So this is a great exercise. I've done it in communities where I've actually done it with people in the same community, and it really gets at the perceptions of what we have, because you might have 5 people from the same community say really different things, and that stirs up some really interesting conversations about why they think those things. Why do we think our social capital is low? Or, why do we think our individual capital is high? And so it can really surface some really interesting ideas about our assets. Yeah, and I just wanted to share it just as a tool for you. Certainly, when we actually start to inventory assets, the 8 capitals can be really useful in a lot of different ways. One way is just inventorying, like, what do we have? I mean, that's where I usually start with communities, is what kinds of assets do we have in each of these categories? Another way to use it is as we're starting to think about the strategies that we're gonna start implementing. And also I use it in measurement. How do we measure these different capitals? as we move through the approach. Next slide, Brett. I thought, Brett, did we have I think we were going to do that Mentimeter thing, but I don't remember where it was.
Yeah, let me take a look. Maybe we might have missed it when we're. Oh, you know, we missed it when we came back from the poll. So yeah, do you want to jump back there?
Yeah, let's do it because I think that would be great. Yeah, so anyway, I really wanted another interactive piece is what are the positive assets in your community? So, you know, for instance, you know, you see all those top 10 places to live lists, and often the reasons communities are on those lists is because they have a lot of these kinds of assets. So I was hoping, and we have a little Mentimeter thing where you can put in your, there it is. So if you go to this link, www.menti.com, and use that code, I would love if each of you could just put in the 3 kind of positive assets in your community. What would land your community on a top 10 places to live list? And I'll start. I live in this town called Heinsberg, Vermont. It's just outside of Burlington. And we have a lot of trails. So I would say we have a lot of trails. We also have, I would consider, really good kind of social capital. Like we have this locally owned grocery store where I go and I see people I know and end up chit-chatting, which can make grocery shopping much longer than it needs to be. And then also what else? Oh, we have some great, like a great food kind of agriculture and food sector, which I'm very proud of. We have some great, we have some great farms, some really interesting kind of food and beverage businesses. Anyway, so here we go. So this is populating from what you guys are entering into this Mentimeter thing, which is really fun. So yes, I see downtowns, we see state and national parks, food scene, yeah. So great, stay on it. If you guys can do that, I love seeing this, it's really fun. So we have lots of assets to work with. I love this, cultural sites, nostalgic. That's, yeah. River access, I see a lot of natural capital. I see some, what I would consider as built capital in terms of architecture and historic sites, outdoor recreation, the downtown, certainly shopping, 4 seasons, great. An ag sector, I think I wrote that one. Fantastic. So you get what I'm talking about. You guys have great assets in your communities already. Gotta look sideways to see some of these. Let's see. Food scene, birding. Yeah, we all have a lot of natural assets. Of course, in rural communities, that is a lot of what we have. My community has a great lake that people recreate on, and we have some beautiful parks. Great. I'm not sure how long we should do this. Immigration. That's interesting. No, this is great. It's fun. Civic engagement. That's a good one. So I would consider that kind of social capital. I think that would also probably be political capital too. So you can see we've already seen natural, social, built, political, I think cultural. We've seen almost all of them here. TA providers, that's great. Philanthropy. This is fantastic. Thank you for playing along. But not easy to make these sessions interactive, so thanks for playing our game. Okay, onward. Great. So yeah, we saw a lot of I think we're on the SWOT, Brett. There we go. So just a lot of different ways that we can think about our assets. And so another one that I've used, and I know others have too, is this idea of using it in terms of a SWOT. And so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you can see here, there are ways of using these capitals in the SWOT. And so I've definitely facilitated conversations like this. So strengths would be the capitals we do have and use. Certainly energy, enthusiasm, partnerships, that social capital piece and the political capital piece. Weaknesses are the capitals we're missing, like if we don't have good built capital, that could be a weakness. It could be that we have a lot of people, firms, and organizations on the economic margins. That would definitely be a weakness, and the lack of partnerships. And then opportunities are some of these underutilized capitals we can actually invest in. If you think about downtowns with vacant buildings, that's an underutilized capital. That's underutilized built capital that you can then invest in to create further opportunities. Upward mobility, we all want that. Emerging markets and demand, thinking about Vernon, using value, thinking about that their agricultural land, that's an opportunity for emerging markets and demand for value-added products. Yeah, there's certainly more there. Threats are certainly policy barriers. Ownership by those outside of the region, that's a big one. I know a lot of downtowns in rural areas are struggling because a lot of their properties are owned by those outside the region who aren't willing to do anything with them. And then, certainly negative opinion shapers and parties unwilling to collaborate are always threats to our work. So this is, it's an interesting way of thinking about a SWOT. I highly recommend, considering those 8 capitals in a SWOT. It's another tool that I wanted to just share. Yeah, so if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, great. So yeah, so now we know what we have, right? We know what kinds of assets we have in our community. Now what? What do we have? So what I typically do when I'm working with communities is we do an inventory of assets or a SWOT or both, and we start to think about what sectors might make sense to focus on. So I was working in Tioga County, New York, for instance, and we went through this process and we had laid out the assets, and we also did a bit of a SWOT, and we started to think about what those assets kind of led us to in terms of sectors. And in that case, they had a lot of natural assets, a lot of agricultural land. They were not far from some tourism regions and recreation. So naturally, kind of our thinking sort of moved into the natural capital, the natural assets, and how could we use those to boost our recreation sector or boost our tourism sector or boost our agritourism sector. So that's just an example, but these are some of the criteria that we use to think about sectors. So for instance, inclusivity and benefits, like, one of the principles of the wealth creation approach is how do we involve and engage people and organizations on the economic margins. That's what this is about. How do we, what's the potential for including and benefiting economically marginalized people and places as part of that sector? And demand, what's the opportunity on the demand side? Is this a growing sector? Is there an opportunity to create demand? Certainly recreation is a huge sector. Since COVID, we've seen people recreating more than normal. So recreation has just exploded over the past year. I think that will continue. So there's demand. Potential for scale. What's the likelihood of bringing this to a meaningful scale? How many livelihoods could it impact if it were built out? Systems change. What is the potential to achieve significant scale over time and ultimately to institutionalize the value chain and make it the new normal. Multiple forms of wealth. Again, this is another way, that you can use those multiple forms of those community capitals. What's the potential of this sector to positively impact multiples of those capitals? Will it impact built capital? Will we be building something? Will it impact our social capital? Ownership and control, again, is another one of our principles. Will it create further local ownership and control of assets? Production potential is, what's the potential to develop production capacity at scale? And what kinds of investments would be required to get there? And competitiveness. Can this sector be developed in a way that makes it competitive with other alternatives? Is it tied to place-based resources and characteristics? So these are some of the criteria that we would use to really think about, now that we know what our assets are, what sectors make sense, and they don't all make sense. So so typically I would actually use this and have a bit of a matrix, as we think about economic sectors to work on, how many of these boxes does it check? So I thought that might be useful in terms of, certainly with Vernon, they're thinking about, where do we go next? We have an agriculture sector. We have some recreation assets. How do we replace that revenue from Vermont Yankee? And so, part of that is thinking about building up other sectors. And again, a lot of what happens with nuclear plants is that becomes the sector. So how do we diversify our economy so that we're not dependent on one sector also is another good thing to think about. Next slide. And I also wanted to share this idea of value chains, which is another key tool of the wealth creation approach. You can see here a value chain is a coordinated network of people, businesses, organizations, and agencies working collaboratively to meet a market demand opportunity. So what demand are we serving? This is just a really basic value chain map. So you can see the demand partners. Those are the buyers of whatever it is we're selling, whether it's a product or a service. The transactional partners are those that are actually touching that product. If we think about agriculture, they would be the producers or the processors or the distributors. And then the support partners are those that actually support the transactional partners. They may be providing technical assistance, they may be providing funding or coaching, but all of these partners are critical to making this value chain work. And they're all communicating also. And typically there's a coordinator. And the coordinator can be its own role. It could be one of these other partners that's kind of taking a leadership role. On the next slide, I actually have a real value chain map for you that I thought might be useful. This is a region I was working with in Western New York called the Genesee Valley. It is home to what is often called the Grand Canyon of the East, which is Letchworth State Park, which is a beautiful park. I've been there. Beautiful gorges, and brings in like almost 1 million visitors every year. And so this is a 5-county region where we were kind of building an outdoor recreation tourism destination and trying to bring people around a 5-county region. So you can see here, they've got their demand partners on the right there. So these are different folks who might be interested in hanging out in the Genesee Valley. If you want to understand what the demand side wants, though, you can't reach out to every single young family and every single baby boomer or antiquer. So when we think about understanding the demand side, we think about aggregating. Who are the aggregators of that demand? So, if we wanted to learn more about hikers, are there hiking clubs that we can start to talk to so we understand what they want? So we try to do that and reach out to those aggregators of demand to better understand what they need. Then you can see the transactional partners. Those are, the typical kinds of things you would think about as a recreationist, right? Restaurants, retailers, lodging, kind of activities, breweries, and then support partners. What do those transactional partners need to be more successful? They need workforce development help. There's training and marketing and broadband, things like that. And then in this case, they actually listed some of their assets there in green. So a lot of natural assets you can see, but they also listed volunteers and retirees. So that's like social capital. And some of the historic buildings would be built capital. And what I love about this map is we facilitated a conversation. I helped facilitate the conversation about this value chain. And we actually were, once we laid this out, we figured out where our gaps were. So everything with kind of a dark outline around it were gaps, were things that were kind of weak that we really needed to work on. That was a lot of things. So we actually prioritized. You can see the ones with the little red dots are where we started our work together. And we formed working groups around those different priority gaps so that we could start to fill out this value chain. And the idea is that a value chain is sort of an evolving document. This is what this value chain looked like at a particular point in time. I would bet that now, if we rethought about this, then hopefully some of those gaps would not be gaps anymore, and maybe there would be different priorities. And I've seen a lot of communities also have something like this, and then like a database with the actual names of the people and the organizations and how to reach them on kind of the back end, so that it's also kind of a really useful resource for making sure we understand who actually fits in each of these boxes. Yeah, so anyway, that's kind of my attempt to share an actual value chain map. There are lots of them on the WealthWorks site. I'm guessing you can see a whole bunch of them also, but this is one I've been pretty intimately engaged with. And they, I think that they've gotten some great funding over the past year, and I have to hope that actually putting the time into building out what the value chain is and where the gaps are makes the story to a potential funder that much stronger too, that you've actually put in the time to think about who is engaged in this work and where the gaps are and where we're going to start to put our efforts. So yes, and the Genesee Valley is a very beautiful place also. So this is, I just wanted to kind of summarize where we got to in this. I mean, I know I went through this fairly quickly. There are a ton of resources on the WealthWorks website. But basically, this is kind of how I start to think about working with communities using the wealth creation approach. So starting by inventorying your assets, what do you have? Some of the resources I shared are how you would start to do that, whether it's the spider diagram or thinking about a SWOT. Starting with market demand, I think there's one in the middle of that too. There's the sectors, right? You inventory your assets, and then you think about what sectors really utilize the assets that you have, that really build on the assets you have. Then start with market demand. What do the demand partners want? What kinds of outdoor recreation do they want? What kinds of value-added food products are people interested in? And then you choose the market opportunities with the greatest wealth building potential, and you really think about those criteria, right? Like what's going to build wealth in our community? What is going to help those on the margins? What's going to create local ownership and control opportunities? And then you start to connect those community assets to market demand. A lot of value chains start by serving local demand, and then build to scale from there. I know certainly in the food sector, I've definitely talked with value chains that served local demand first with local agricultural products, and then eventually built their value chain out to be more regional. And then map the process and partners from input to end customer. So the value chain is a great tool to start to see what that sector and that market opportunity actually look like, what kinds of partners you actually have engaged, and who are you missing? You know, what other kinds of partners do you need to engage to be successful? You know, are all the functions accounted for? You know, if we're thinking about a product, do we have someone to fit into all of those boxes from producer to consumer? Or you can think about it with services also. And then identify the gaps. That's, you know, that once you see, I think the value chain is a great visual tool to have people understand, you know, where the gaps are. It becomes much clearer when you lay it out that way. And those gaps then become the strategies that you're going to implement. And also it creates great opportunities for new entrepreneurs in particular sectors. I've seen a lot of great stories, a lot of great value chains where there are opportunities for new businesses that come out of those. And like, for instance, you know, in the Genesee Valley, if I'm thinking, you know, one of the gaps has been transportation. And so they're starting to think about, can they create a rural on-demand kind of transportation system for those traveling through the region? And is that a new, you know, entrepreneurial opportunity for folks in the region to serve? So that's what I've got. And I think the last slide is just my information and also the WealthWorks website. The WealthWorks website is a great resource. There are a ton of things to see there. There's modules, so you can learn more about the wealth creation approach. There's videos, there are success stories, including the Genesee Valley, I think might be up there, and others that are in different sectors. So I would definitely encourage you to check that out if this is at all interesting. And I'm always willing to chat also about wealth creation. And yeah, I don't know. There's time. It seems like there's time for questions. So.
Absolutely. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for the presentation and you know, kind of starting us off in Vernon as a really great case study, and then talking a bit more about the theory, and then kind of in practice, you know, what this looks like. You know, we at the NADO Research Foundation been kind of working in this space for quite a while, and you know, really see some phenomenal case studies and examples, and just creating a real language and framework for communities to talk about these issues. I think is what's so powerful about it. So thank you so much for the presentation, as always. We do have time for some questions. We've had a few come in, which I'll get to in a moment, but encourage all of you to type in that questions box, and we'll try to get to a few of those in about the 10 minutes we have remaining. So I'll also make sure to include the links to WealthWorks, some of the case studies we've talked about, that spider diagram. That's also available in the handouts.
Sorry, maybe I would say also, like, I wonder, you know, I'm assuming we have people from all over the country. Certainly I focus on the Northeast, but there are folks like me who do this work in other parts of the country. So, you know, that's something else you can see on the WealthWorks website is the folks that are actually the hubs that actually do this work in all over the country. So not that I don't love working in all parts of the country, but there are folks closer to you probably too.
Definitely. So. Yeah, there's a national network of hubs that are working together closely, sharing ideas. So it's a whole movement, which is really exciting. So yeah, just want to get to a few of the questions, and again, encourage you to type those in as they come to you. But one of the first questions that came in, Melissa, is asking about kind of examples of value chains, and are there certain sectors that you think lend themselves better to this model than others? I mean, I know you mentioned outdoor recreation, which we've seen powerful food systems, but what are some other ones that you've seen around the country, ones that maybe work well and maybe some that are a little bit harder to get off the ground just because of the nature?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I've certainly seen them in agriculture and forestry. Certainly recreation is a big one. We see recreation and tourism a ton because so many rural communities are trying to build up those kinds of assets. I worked on kind of arts. If people are interested in the arts and the creative economy, that's worked really well too. And there are some great examples on the WealthWorks website of affordable housing, energy, kind of energy efficiency, and renewable energy kinds of stories. And certainly, as we're talking about nuclear and replacing an energy source, that's an interesting one to think about. I think the possibilities are pretty endless, though I do think it helps to have something pretty concrete. I was working with an organization around workforce development, and certainly there's a demand for workforce development all over the place, but that's one that's hard to get out of, like a subsidy kind of situation, I feel like. I think, you can think about services. It's just really important to think about, again, who the demand is, and how does the investment happen? Like, how do you invest in something like that? So I think some of the traditional kind of rural sectors are the ones I think that we see the most. But I do think, just about anything can become that. So
absolutely, yeah, I think it's important to remember this is an evolving practice, and so there's really kind of endless opportunities for how to explore these issues. And we did have a few kind of comments about the multiple forms of wealth, and people really liking that language and approach. And I guess that question came in here asking about, as you mentioned with the spider diagram, if you kind of bring it to a room of 50 people, you might get 50 different approaches and perspectives. Is the idea to find some sort of consensus, or can you kind of work with the kind of the unknown and the differences? Kind of what happens when there's not necessarily agreement on what this looks like?
I use that more as a discussion tool, actually. Is the idea is to understand why people have these perceptions, and because not everybody sees the whole community, right? If you think about a community, not everybody sees everything, right? You have your own perspective that you see, if you think about town government, for instance, like I am on a town committee, so I feel like town government works pretty well, but others may see, the other side of that, right, where they're unhappy about something. And I actually just think it's a really useful tool to just understand what people think. I don't know if I haven't used it to get consensus. I think it creates really interesting discussions. I think it could potentially help people get to some sort of consensus, but it might take a while to have those conversations. But I think they're really valuable conversations to have. I think, that's the one thing about this approach is I think that community capitals piece is the thing that really grabs people, and that regardless of what you do about value chains or any of the other stuff, I think that is the most important piece to take away. Even in just regular economic development, I think it's useful to think about capital in that way. But yeah, I think that spider diagram just creates some really interesting conversations. I think it could be a great icebreaker, actually, for a community meeting, is just to do that and start to have some conversations. But I think you can educate people that way too about, what counts in these different capitals, and how things are going from these different perspectives.
Absolutely, great, yeah, great framework and great kind of conversation starter to kind of move the process. So great, thanks, Melissa. So I'm seeing a few comments from our friend Cheryl Hills in central Minnesota, who's doing phenomenal work at the Region 5 Development Commission. For those of you on the call that work at economic development districts or regional development organizations, Cheryl's just a great example of an organization and staff that's really embraced this approach and really embedded it and infused it into all the work that they do. So I do want to shout out Cheryl's work. I also include some links to some of the work that they've done. So again, from that regional perspective. So
they have really done some amazing reports where they've used the capitals to measure progress, and they have some great value chains to share. So thanks, Cheryl.
Of course, I was being humble in the chat now too, but I did want to call out the good work there. So, a couple other kind of points I just want to bring up, Melissa. One, about engaging elected officials around this work. This approach to economic development is it's really about doing economic development differently. So it looks a little bit different. It's a different timeline. The optics are different in a lot of ways. So, any thoughts about kind of interactions you've had with elected officials or language and buy-in? Just again, because it is a different approach, and the metrics look a little bit different, but just kind of curious kind of your experience on that front.
Yeah, I've found local officials to be pretty open-minded. I think certainly they can, the folks that I've worked with can definitely get their arms around the capitals, and it definitely gives them a language to really expand out that idea of assets and what do we have in a way that I don't think other frameworks do. I think, in terms of the value chains, local elected officials, typically would play more of a support role in a value chain. So in that sense, I think that's the role they're meant to play, is a supporting role. They're not going to be leading a value chain, and that's okay. You want entrepreneurial people and businesses to kind of form the basis of that value chain. But I do think most of the local elected officials I've connected with really do understand it and appreciate it, and more often than not are willing to play that supporting role to a burgeoning value chain. Yeah, I certainly I haven't. That's a good question. I push it in my own community. I feel like so many communities and local elected officials are just dealing with the latest crisis. So it's not easy to always look ahead and plan as well as we'd like to, so. Yeah.
Great, so we got time for one more question here, and that's just asking about kind of hurdles to implementation, not to end on a negative note here, but what are some of the challenges here? I mean, of course, this isn't easy work. It's time consuming, it's partner intensive. What are some of the challenges that maybe you've experienced or have seen communities, and of course, how to kind of overcome them?
Sure, yeah, thinking about, I'm gonna go back to the Genesee Valley because that is most recent in my mind. They brought together like 80 partners to do that work. And so one challenge is, how do you keep those folks engaged? How do you continually engage as a coordinator? How do you continually engage 80 partners? And the answer is, not all of them are going to be engaged all the way through. There are certain things that they're interested in, certain parts of the value chain that apply to them, and certain strategies. But you have to have I feel like that means you have to have a strong coordinator. And Nicole Manopel in the Genesee Valley really is amazing. And she has a team behind her. She's working with a local university that also is supporting this work. So she has, I think, partners, institutional partners can really help in that way. I think SUNY Geneseo, which is the local college there, has really allowed her to do this coordination as part of her work. So that's been incredible. I know she's done a great job of keeping people engaged by having like a regular newsletter. So even if people aren't actively engaged, they kind of know what's happening, and she can call on them when she needs to. So I think it's a big job, but without it, those partnerships can go by the wayside. To me, that's one of the most important parts of this, is just maintaining the social capital and the political capital around all of those partnerships is critical. Whether you're building a value chain or not, if you want to build one of these sectors, I think those partnerships are key. And keeping people engaged in whatever way you can is a big deal. So that's been, and I think you will see that in a lot of the success stories actually on the WealthWorks website too, shows, the key leaders and the key coordinators in those stories are really important. Yeah, well, and that's a 5-county region too. So there's local governments, there's foundations, there's nonprofits and small businesses, and they all have a part to play. So maintaining that is a challenge, but also a huge part of it.
Great. Well, Melissa, again, thank you so much. We're at the end of the hour here. I want to give you a chance for kind of any last final words of wisdom. You've given us so much here, but anything you want to plug or share as we wrap up?
No, I'm really just, thanks for having me. It's always fun to do things with NADO and the Research Foundation. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I hope that you guys will start to explore some of at least the capitals, I think will come in handy for everyone, I'm hoping. So.
Definitely. Thank you again. So yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, the recording, you'll get an email tomorrow with the recording and slides, and we'll provide some other links as well for some of the resources that we were chatting about today. Of course, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone else on the project team if you have any questions about the technical assistance program and the resources we provide. We are here for you. We're here to support your work. So I hope you can take advantage of that. Just briefly, when you close out, there'll be a quick survey that of course will pop up on the screen. Give us some feedback about today's presentation, kind of where things are, what you're learning, what your needs are, and give us a little bit of feedback there too, which helps us continue with this work. So with that, we'll close out. Melissa, again, thanks so much for your time and expertise, and for everyone for joining us. And stay tuned for more webinars and roundtables and other opportunities that will provide to nuclear communities through this project, which we're really thrilled to be a part of. So with that, we'll sign off. Be well, take care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Bye-bye.
Bye.